atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how are you this morning?
Well, I am riding high after the Cleveland Browns clinched their second playoff berth in 21 years. So it's a great day in Cleveland. And I usually have something clever political joke to say, but this was more important. So
okay. Well, I understand this time of year being a football fan, not a Browns fan, but I certainly can appreciate that coming.
Which is strange, of course. You're always a contrarian. You're a Pittsburgh fan while you lived in Cleveland.
That's right. That's well, you know me. Anyway, well, we've had a little bit of a break from the show. We took our annual 1 week break last week. And of course, the news did not stop coming. And we have a lot of things to talk about today, both on our regular show and in the midweek show for supporters that comes out on Tuesday. We're going to be talking about a bunch of rulings about Donald Trump's eligibility to be on primary ballots, the migrant caravan approaching the United States, and some immigration issues. Supreme Court not taking up Trump's immunity from prosecution claim, jumping the D.C. circuit there. A little bit about Harvard and its president, Claudine Gay, and the problems she's gotten herself into. Some trade stuff, some polls, a bunch of predictions. We've got a lot coming up, and I think we should probably just get right to it, Jay. So why don't we start with those eligibility claims for Donald Trump?
Yeah, so our first story breaking just last night, Maine's Democratic Secretary of State removed former President Donald Trump from the state's presidential primary ballot, citing the Constitution's insurrection clause. This is the first election official to take action unilaterally on this issue. The decision follows a ruling earlier this month by the Colorado Supreme Court that booted Trump from the Colorado primary ballot, and then also breaking earlier this week a non-decision, essentially, by the Michigan Supreme Court not to accept jurisdiction from a ballot challenge there, where the Court of Appeals dismissed the case to have Trump removed from the ballot, largely on the grounds that the court reasoned that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment was not self-executing. You needed Congress to do something in order to effect the removal. So that's where we stand right now, is Trump off in Colorado, off in Maine, although there will be obviously some challenges to the Maine decision. It wasn't a court decision. Again, this is a Secretary of State who made the call. And there are other cases going forward, I believe in California. I should have had the list teed up here, but
actually in California, the Secretary of State there declined to remove Trump from the ballot. And she said that one of the things she mentioned along those lines was that, it's not something her office takes lightly, and it's not as simple as the requirement that a person be at least 35 years old to be president. And I think that's obviously a fair point, certainly.
Yeah. So with that, Mike, I guess what are your thoughts on where this goes next? Obviously, I think this ends up at the U.S. Supreme Court, although you could make an argument that maybe it doesn't. But your thoughts on the Maine and Michigan decisions?
Well, I don't see how it can't end up at the Supreme Court, simply because we can't just have every individual state. I think they could decline to accept jurisdiction. Yeah. I don't think it could happen, but I don't think the court. Well, yeah, I understand. Right. There's a mechanism by which it could not end up, because the court can choose not. But I think the court will, and rightly so, because the situation we have now is not a good one at all, to say the least. And so obviously in the California and the Colorado decisions are less consequential politically because those are states that Donald Trump would likely get no electoral votes were he the nominee. But the Maine decision, a little bit different, even though there aren't a lot of electoral votes there. Maine splits its electoral votes. And I believe last time Donald Trump got one. And so that's a little more consequential. But
every vote counts.
Well, apparently, yeah. But I think I think that, as we talked about before, I believe that there are good arguments to be made on both sides of this. There's a lot of gray area. It's not as if Donald Trump took up arms literally against the government, charged the Capitol with musket and AR-15, whatever. That would be a clear-cut case. And there is so much gray area here. And as I said, when we talked about this the last time, that given the amount of uncertainty about a number of elements of this case, because number one, we have to determine whether or not under the insurrection clause, the president is an officer of the United States. Now, the common sense understanding would be yes, but there have been plausible arguments made that, well, maybe not. Secondly,
and we've discussed that because in the Constitution, it seems to set aside president from other officers of the United States.
Yes, although it can be
inferior officers.
It can be reasonably argued that would be nonsensical, and it's sort of a rule of statutory interpretation that is there. If there is a nonsensical interpretation, you discard that one for one that actually makes. Yeah, exactly. So, but that's only one of the issues. The second one then is, even if we assume that the president is an officer of the United States, did Donald Trump engage in insurrection or rebellion? Well, you need to take a look at what is insurrection, what is rebellion, and what exactly does it mean to engage in that? And even if he didn't, did he give aid and comfort to enemies of the United States? These are not clear issues, and you pile these three main issues one on top of the other, and I think anyone should be troubled to have a Secretary of State or an individual state Supreme Court to make these decisions. This is something that is crying out for a clear and definitive interpretation from the Supreme Court. And I'm sure that's what we're going to get in short order. What do you think, Jay?
I think the court probably will, I would say, 80-20. I'm not 100% still. But the court will weigh in eventually. I guess the question for me, and this is kind of a curious one, is you get into weird questions of what are questions of fact versus questions of law, right? Typically, the U.S. Supreme Court does not sit as a trial court, if you will, determining, who's telling the truth, who's not telling the truth, what happened, but just reviews legal decisions from lower courts that have made those factual determinations. I guess I'm a little concerned in that there are probably some factual findings that would need to go into a determination of insurrection. Not entirely. I think there's ways you can decide it entirely on legal grounds. You could just say, look, insurrection is this, and this was not an insurrection. But you think maybe you need some either whether it's stipulated facts or some predicate factual finding before you kind of get into those questions. Now again, like what the Michigan appellate court did, saying, look, it's not self-executing. Okay, that's a pure legal question. That can go up directly. But otherwise, I think there is sort of a troubling. What I'm saying is you don't necessarily get there with a clean record. And my concern is that the Supreme Court would not want to jump into what could be perceived as fact finding. But at the same time, it is sort of a mixed issue.
I would argue differently. I don't think that they have to do any fact finding here. If they make a determination as to, number one, whether or not that the insurrection clause is self-executing. Number two, they make a determination.
Right, that's an easy way out. Yeah.
Right. Number two, they make a determination as to whether or not the president is an officer of the United States under the insurrection clause. And
that's another one.
And number three, they make a determination as to what constitutes insurrection, rebellion, giving aid and comfort to the enemies thereof. That wouldn't involve any of the facts of the case, and then they could just send that back down, saying, "Here are the guidelines, and go ahead and figure this out." And I think that would be a reasonable way for the court to handle it, and I hope that's what they do.
Yeah, I think the third one you do get into some factual determinations.
How so?
Which, as you said, what the court could say, we'll send it back down.
Okay.
But that doesn't solve your problem.
And also, I'd say that in the main instance, it almost seemed like the Secretary of State was specifically attempting to try to tee it up for the Supreme Court, because she suspended she said, I will suspend the effect of my decision until the Superior Court rules on any appeal, and the time to appeal has expired. So it sounds like it's basically pushing the court to decide this, which I think is certainly a good thing, because we have a number of additional challenges along these lines. I believe there are something like active lawsuits in 14 states. Originally, there were something like 30. A number of them have been dismissed. And so this definitely needs to get ironed out before the primaries, which are coming very quickly. I think Maine's or Michigan's is, I believe, in the end of February, which obviously is not that far off.
Well, you could make the argument that, well, yes and no. It's not easy, but that, look, it's one thing to say Trump will be allowed on the ballot, but is subject to, right? He kind of does so at his own peril, possibly being disqualified further down the line. That has a bigger protection as opposed to, you're not going to be able to be on the ballot, and making that determination now.
Well,
now that doesn't help, because then if he is disqualified, how do you get someone else in? Now, typically there are mechanisms in most states to allow substitutions, but no, I'm not saying that's an easy route. But
you're saying have the name.
I'm saying as a practical matter, sure. I don't know that there will be a definitive decision on this before some primaries actually start happening.
I don't see why not. I mean, I know on December 27th, the Colorado Republican Party appealed that state's Supreme Court ruling, and there's no reason why the court couldn't take this up in an expedited manner. This is, I think, I can't see any reason why the court would need a month or so to deliberate on this.
Well, because it's a really, really big question. This is why. Both sides would argue, listen, we need time to brief, to set this for oral argument. There would be rafts and rafts of amici showing up.
But those aren't necessary.
And look, it's a big, constitutional crisis type decision. So I think the court could well say, we're not going to be bound by your state ballot deadline. We're going to take our time and we're not going to rush this.
Well, it's a big question, but it's not, I would argue, an incredibly complex question. And so I don't think the court would need to rush, certainly. It seems to me entirely likely that the court will reach a decision well in advance of any of the voting. And certainly, you're right, you could certainly have a situation where Donald Trump's name is printed on the ballots, but I don't see there being any problem with a decision before sometime in, like I said, late February, when Michigan has its primary election. So, but when that decision comes down, and I think it will come down, the court, I am almost certain, will rule in such a way that Donald Trump's name will appear on all of the primary ballots, and I think that's the correct ruling.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you there as well, but
and that's,
we'll see.
Yeah, and that's something we talked about. We talked about now. Different question would be if Donald Trump were actually convicted of insurrection by some body, obviously in a court of law, then that would be a different question. But as I've said before, even though I am obviously not a fan of Donald Trump, and I think he's just horrific for America, that does not mean that the voters should not be allowed to choose that horrific candidate unless he is clearly disqualified.
Yeah, democracy means giving the voters what they want, good and hard.
There you go, H.L. Mencken. Absolutely.
H.L. Mencken.
Yep. All right. Any other thoughts on this one before we move on, Jay?
No. Otherwise, and look, it's going to. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better.
How so?
Well, one. I mean, you're going to have other secretaries of state or state supreme courts or whomever, right, making decisions as we get closer and closer to primaries.
Which, of course, they have to do. I mean, they need.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah,
I see what you're saying. Right. Gotcha.
Yeah, just based on the calendar, based on the situation on the ground, it's going to get worse before it gets better. And then the other piece is, I think there will be very much it's been a continuing campaign from the likes of Sheldon Whitehouse and so forth to discredit the Supreme Court, to call into question the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. And I think this will heighten those decisions, and a decision by the court saying that Trump should remain on the ballots will be viewed in some quarters as, look, plainly this is all corruption, and justices who were appointed by Trump should recuse themselves, etc.
Sure. Absolutely. That's the game.
That's what I'm saying, where it's going to get ugly. Yeah.
And certainly that's the game on both sides, right? Donald Trump himself has been not shy about saying that any decision that goes against him in any way, shape, or form is clearly the result of corruption, even a presidential.
Well, obviously.
Yeah. There was an interesting argument that one of the attorneys, and I forget which case presented, I hadn't thought about this, but I wanted to mention it, kind of clever. The argument was that Donald Trump is ineligible under the 22nd Amendment because it says that no person shall be elected to the office of president more than twice. And so this attorney's argument is, well, Donald Trump is claiming he's been elected to the office twice. He won. So therefore, clearly not an argument that's going anywhere, but I give it points for originality, I got to say. So that's an interesting argument. But anyway, all right, well, we will have more on this as events merit, and they certainly will in the coming weeks. Moving on to a different issue, immigration. There's this migrant caravan of somewhere around 7,500 people headed toward the southern border of the U.S., most of the migrants originally from Central America, Cuba, Venezuela, I think even some from Haiti. And some of these caravan members allegedly are hoping to stay in Mexico. Many, of course, would like to end up in the United States. Now, this week, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken met with Mexican President Obrador to discuss how to slow the flow of migrants into the U.S. And according to officials, so somewhere around 10,000 crossings per day last week. And following that meeting, the administration said that Mexico shared its plans to crack down on smugglers who've been very important in moving large numbers of migrants to the borders. Now, Mexican officials told the media that the discussions also focused on economic considerations and the structural root causes of this surge in migration. And also, I'll point out, last week, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson sent a letter to President Biden in which he wrote that the southern border was being overrun, called the situation a catastrophe that's caused unspeakable human tragedy for migrants as well as U.S. citizens. Now, Johnson urged Biden to take executive actions to stem the tide, including the ending of the so-called catch and release policy of releasing migrants claiming asylum into the community while they're awaiting a hearing as opposed to detaining them or turning them away. He called for the ending of the practice of granting parole, which allows non-citizens temporarily to enter the U.S. to groups of migrants, and saying it should only happen on a case-by-case basis. He said Biden should work with Mexico to reinstate that remain in Mexico policy for migrants applying for asylum, as well as to expand expedited removal for migrants who can't demonstrate eligibility for asylum. He also said something about restarting border wall construction, this kind of a thing as well. And finally, Johnson said Biden can actually do this under his authority under Section 212F of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which authorizes the president to suspend the entry of all aliens or any class of aliens whose entry he finds would be detrimental to the interests of the United States. And it's worth mentioning that in 2018, Trump versus Hawaii, the Supreme Court ruled that that section, in its words, I love this phrase, exudes deference to the president in every clause. It entrusts him the decisions as to whether or when to suspend entry, whose entry to suspend, for how long, and on what conditions. And so it gives the president, in the court's words, ample power to impose entry restrictions in addition to those elsewhere enumerated in the INA. And so there you go, Jay. There's a lot of immigration stuff in that. What's your read on all this?
I think the Biden administration is realizing that it's got to address this somehow. The numbers are just too big. The story won't go away. And when you do consider the magnitude, and again, if you think back a year or two ago when the first surge, the response was, well, this is just seasonal. This is seasonal, parentheses, you idiot. So I think they've realized, no, it's not seasonal. 10,000 a day. I live in a city of roughly 50,000 people. So it's like a new city being added once a week. If you count up the number of migrants who have crossed the border, and these are just the documented encounters, right? There's still a number of getaways that aren't counted in there. I think it was 6 million. Does that sound right? In the last, since Biden took office. Again, that's half the state of Ohio, and bigger than a lot of states. These are tremendous numbers. And I'm not sure why there's been the unwillingness to take these sort of steps, particularly, again, the Remain Mexico seems to be the smartest. The asylum system is broken, and I think you can argue, well, okay, that has to be fixed statutorily. But there's proposals out there to do that. And I think as a lot of these bigger city mayors starting to, the crisis is starting to hit them, there's become more concern in the White House that this is something that is going to need to be addressed.
Yeah, I think the reason why, or at least a big part of the reason why it hasn't been addressed is that, and you say this a lot, Jay, both sides want the issue to run on as opposed to find some sort of solution. Yeah. But also, but I'm wondering
at this point, why do Democrats want the issue anymore?
Well, I think that's becoming more and more a live question, right, in certain areas. And I would argue,
it used to be, I guess I'll answer my own question. The answer used to be, well, because it's fun to be able to paint the other side as xenophobic bigots and anti-Hispanic and so forth, and just generally cruel and uncaring. But I think that argument is easier to make when the numbers are a lot lower.
I don't think so. I think that it's the same argument. It just creates more. If there is one person who needs asylum for whatever reason, a legitimate asylum seeker who's been persecuted, that's awful. If there are 100, it's even worse. But the question is not, well, if you're not letting them in, how do you deal with that? How do you come up with the capacity? And that's the issue. And so there are plenty of people in this country, sad to say, who are xenophobic, who don't believe that people coming in from Central America should be allowed into this country because, well, for various reasons. And that's unfortunate, but I don't think it's a bad argument to make. And I think that's really at the heart of a lot of the certainly concern I have is that there are some very important factors driving this incredible upswing in encounters in migration in the last few years. Some horrific stuff happening in Central America. And it's part of, it should be, I think, part of our DNA as a country to want to take in people who are fleeing persecution, right? And that's what's more American than that. The problem, of course, is that we don't have the capacity to do it in any kind of efficient, reasonable way, right? That's the problem. And so just saying, well, we're just going to turn away people without any kind of a plan, there's the rub, right? Now, if I were Joe Biden, I think at this point,
I think the plan is you remain in Mexico till your asylum hearing.
Well, that's fine, but that requires a certain amount of cooperation from the Mexican government, obviously, and not only that, but there are concerns about safety of these folks, and I think reasonable concerns, right? And so you can't just push aside the humanitarian concerns, right?
No, but I also think that there's, to some extent, has the administration exacerbated the humanitarian concerns by signaling that, once you make it here, you're in. And I think that's been the signal, or it's certainly been the signal that's been received.
That's certain, yeah.
And I think that's
fair to say.
So I think that's part of it is you could communicate much more clearly, saying, listen, please don't do this. And part of that is if you do this, we're going to send you back or require you to remain in Mexico or apply from some other third country. And I don't think that's unreasonable. I mean, so something that hit me the other day, right, is sort of the parallel. Now, this doesn't necessarily say, U.S. policy is correct, but shows sort of a, I don't know, selective view of this. If you consider what's happening in Gaza, where you have, all these refugees who are trying to get out, trying to flee, and who I think would, by any definition in any book, qualify as asylum seekers, and the countries around them, particularly I would say Egypt, has not been willing to let them in, and we have this situation here where conditions in many places in South and Central America are terrible, but I'd say they're not an active war zone. I mean, I think that's just worth considering when you think about what is the obligation of a country to take in asylum seekers. And
I would argue.
I think there's one more thing is the qualifications for asylum, right? We've got them written down, and it's pretty much agreed that a good 90%, probably even higher, of the folks who are coming in would not meet those qualifications, will not meet those qualifications when they have a hearing.
That's fine, but they still get a hearing. And that's their right under the law, and they should get a hearing. Now, we don't have a system that is set up to give them a hearing in any sort of an efficient, expeditious way. We have a backlog, I believe, of over 2 million cases at this point. And so I feel like on the Democratic side, the question is, well, what are Republicans offering aside from just saying, well, let's just close the doors and keep them closed? And I don't really hear a whole lot. Now, I think it would be worthwhile to consider the president using his authority under was it 212F that I mentioned, and I think you can make a case that Joe Biden could just say, you know what, we're just halting all asylum claims, all border entry until such a but there would need to be the Republicans giving something on that. If you want to say, well, our system is broken. Well, okay, we'll halt entries for a while or slow them in some way that's not discriminatory. That was the problem in the Trump versus Hawaii case, at least among the 4 dissenters. But what are we going to do to fix the system? And that needs to be a second part of it. So maybe that means a lot more money to beef up the system so we can clear that backlog and we can hear these cases, right? Maybe it means.
Yeah, no, I think that's fine. And I wouldn't object to that. And I think most Republicans wouldn't. The bigger piece is, and this has been the argument since like the 1980s, right? Is that the border security has to come first, because otherwise you have a continuing incentive of look, even if you're, once you're here, you're less likely, I mean, you've sort of gotten what you wanted. And that incentive still exists, and you can say, listen, okay, you get to U.S. soil, and you're there for a good 2 years, pending a hearing, and then maybe the hearing goes your way, maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't, well, you get sent back, and then you come across again, and then you get another couple of years. So that's the problem, and I think that argument the Republicans have made for years is, were okay in talking about path to citizenship, those types of things, but we've got to secure the border first, because if you start having the path to citizenship or quicker reform before that, you're just going to encourage more and more people to cross the border illegally.
I think that's a disingenuous argument, and the reason why is that practically, as in on the ground, that's certainly correct. But the argument that's being made politically, and that's what I'm talking about, the disingenuous part, because the argument is, well, let's secure the border first, and then we'll talk about this other stuff. But what's almost certain to happen is that if the Democrats say, okay, we'll agree to more border security, keeping more people out, then the second part will never happen. That's why politically it has to happen together.
What do you think? Why do you think that, I guess, is that, I mean, again, the asylum things, we still have places to process.
But I'm saying politically it has to happen together. Because if it doesn't, then Democrats are just going to be giving Republicans something they want, and Republicans are just going to end up not giving Democrats anything. That's how politics works. That's how the sausage is made, as you like to say, Jay. And so it would be
okay. But here's the way I look at it, though, right? I mean, if you want to say contemporaneous, I would be okay with that too. But the typical argument has been, let's come up with, Democrats will not vote for any sort of immigration reform, and I don't think the Democrats want simply more administrative judges to handle asylum claims. I don't think that's the agenda. So I mean, that's if that were the case, I think there would be a deal already.
I don't think so at all. I don't think so at all. I think John asked a question here, who's with us, how much border security first is enough, right? It'll never be 100% secure. And I think
it'll never be 100%.
Right, but I think that for at least a significant number of Republicans, at least large enough in the House to stop up anything, it's just an issue to run on. And they don't really necessarily care about border security or immigration. They just care about having that issue and fanning the flames of nativism and whatever it is that.
I think that's a little disingenuous.
Okay.
Because again, this isn't a matter of one or two people. This is millions and millions of people. Again, as we said, 10,000 a day. It's a humanitarian crisis, no matter how you look at it. And part of what is driving that humanitarian crisis, or this movement of these many people into the country this quickly, is the idea that the border is essentially open, and it is. I mean, and I would agree, you can't have 100% security, but at this point we have just about 0%.
I think that's wrong. That's hyperbole. It's not about 0%. It's not an open border. So I would disagree fundamentally with that.
Well, I guess 10,000 a day. What percent is that?
Well, I don't know that you can really put it in a percent, but I think using language like we have open borders and no border security is not at all helpful and not at all accurate. I certainly agree with you that border security could be better.
Let me push on that a little bit. Why isn't it accurate?
Because the idea that the border is open is just false. There are plenty of people who are turned away all the time. The bigger problem is that there is this surge of migrants who understandably want to flee horrible conditions in their home countries for the United States. I certainly don't blame them for that. But the idea that we're just the border is open, that's a dog whistle kind of phrase that's not useful at all. Now, if you want to say that, well, border security is not at all sufficient to deal with the crisis that we have, I would absolutely agree with you 100%. But I can't countenance the sort of what I believe is inaccurate and inflammatory phraseology that you were using there.
All right. Well, yeah, I guess my question is, if someone approaches and crosses the border illegally, what happens to them? And if the answer is, well, they're let go on their own parole to come to a hearing a couple of years from now, that strikes me as essentially being open. Right? I mean, I'm not sure how many people are turned away and sent back. If that is a big number, we're not seeing it, and it's certainly much smaller than the number of people who are coming in.
Right. we're not exactly talking past each other. We just have a fundamental disagreement here. And if you want to use the term open, that's fine. I'll just sort of lodge my objection for the
right. I understand that. Yeah, on the Democratic side, that they've viewed the idea of open border that as some sort of a dog whistle. But I think at some point, there has to be some sort of concession to reality, right? I mean, this was kind of like when the silly Mayorkas comments, about, well, the border is secure. Well, of course
it's not secure. No. Well, I mean, again, that gets into these semantic games of what do we mean by secure? Now, if you argue that, well, the people are coming in for asylum claims and they're being let in and paroled, and does that mean the border isn't secure? Well, not necessarily, right? Then you have to look into the issue of, well, what percentage of these people show up for their asylum hearings? What I'm saying is it becomes a far more complex issue that people want to just boil down into a little phrase that you can fit on a bumper sticker or on a tweet. And that just fundamentally mischaracterizes the complexity of the border security issue.
I'll just close with this. If you compare, say, Egypt and Gazans trying to get into Egypt, that border is secure. They're not getting in. They're not coming in. They're not getting asylum hearings. They're not being put on parole. They're not getting in. That's what I think a lot of people mean by secure. Is it that the country can stop people from coming in, and at this point we are unable and or unwilling to do so.
I think in part because we're not Egypt, we're the United States, and we hold ourselves to a higher humanitarian standard, as well we should.
But we also have to hold ourselves to our own laws.
Well, I don't think laws are being, if you're making an argument that
the illegal immigration piece.
But it's not illegal immigration if somebody is making an asylum claim. And under our system of laws, it is lawful for these people to be making claims to be paroled into the United States while their claim is being adjudicated. So that there's nothing unlawful there. You might not like it, and I may agree with you, but that doesn't make it unlawful. I think that's an important distinction to make here.
All right. Fair enough.
Okay. All right, then. Well, let's move on to, actually coming back to Donald Trump, right? Supreme Court, not in the last, I think not a little more than a week ago. This is a story.
So this is another, in essence, a non-decision, right? Is that the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the special counsel's request that it decide immunity, Trump's presidential immunity from prosecution for the January 6th insurrection riot early on, right? The idea being that this would hasten the process. It would essentially remove that, it would determine either that Trump could use that defense or could not, and would speed up the ability to prosecute. And the Supreme Court, I think, wisely declined to do so, and instead said, let this, well, they didn't really say anything, right? It's just a non-decision, unsigned, no dissents. So that tells you there were less than 5 members of the Supreme Court who thought they should hear this case immediately. So, what happens then is it now goes to the more normal course of you go through the trial court, go to the appeals court, and at that point, it's teed up for the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yeah, at this point now, the trial court judge actually ruled on this. And so the D.C. Circuit, I believe, has agreed to hear it, and they have agreed to hear the appeal on an expedited basis. Oral arguments are scheduled for January 9th. And I point out that Jack Smith noted in making a request to the Supreme Court that it was an extraordinary request. And I agree with you that the court was right to deny it, given the fact that it seems that the D.C. Circuit is really going to deal with this in an expedited fashion. So it will certainly come to the Supreme Court, but I don't think there's necessarily any compelling reason to leapfrog the D.C. Circuit on this. And I also find the arguments from some of the sort of further left progressive press that, oh my God, this was a major victory for Donald Trump, and it's this horrific non-decision by the court. I'll point out that, the the three liberals on the court could have dissented. That sometimes happens in these instances if there's strong feelings, but that was not the case. And so I think this is, perfectly okay. The thing to me that's a little more interesting is Donald Trump's immunity argument in the first place. And I agree with the trial judge here that, there's no special immunity for presidents about criminal actions, right? And I should point out the Supreme Court has previously held that presidents are immune from civil liability from actions that are related to their official duties as president. Now, they've never directly addressed the question of criminal liability. And also, you can certainly question whether or not some of the things Trump did or is alleged to have done can be seen as related to his official duties. And those are the sort of questions that a court would decide. And so I don't think there's any kind of blanket immunity here. This is just effort to delay the proceedings until, ideally, in Trump's view, after January of 2025, if he wins the election. I wanted to get your take, both, I guess, on that immunity claim, as well as how you think this is going to affect the trial dates and any potential ruling by a court.
So the immunity claim, I think I would tend to agree. No, it's certainly not a slam dunk. I don't think there is a blanket immunity. I think it's arguable to say, listen, if I'm the president of the United States, I am charged with seeing that the laws are faithfully executed, and I believe that there has been election fraud. I can advise my vice president to do what I think would have been a vain ministerial act, and that's within the powers of the presidency. I'm not saying that claim wins the day, right? I think there's a whole lot of dots that you need to connect there. But I'm saying I don't think the immunity claim is out and out frivolous.
And also, Jay, on that, I'd point out that immunity doesn't have to be blanket. You could say, well, Donald Trump has immunity for that, but not necessarily for
qualified
trying to influence, to influence state election proceedings and that sort of thing. So, I think that's a good point. Yeah.
So I think, that is. I would say certainly, telling if the argument is, well, it went down to Georgia and told the Secretary of State, I need you to fabricate fraud, which is how it's being read, right? And you can that conversation two different ways. One is that Trump says, look, just find me the fraud because I know it's there, and I just need you to point it out. Or that the message is, I want you to make stuff up in order to essentially derail this otherwise legitimate electoral process. And again, that comes down to sort of questions of fact. But agree this ends up before the U.S. Supreme Court eventually, probably sooner rather than later, and we'll see how it goes from there. I would also point out, to the extent that from all the Supreme Court conspiracy theorists had the conservatives on the court wanted to just grant Trump that blanket immunity, they could have decided to take the case and done so. And that they didn't, I think, sort of belies the conspiracy claims.
I wouldn't go that far, because if you're making a sophisticated conspiracy claim, you say that, well, you put your thumb on the scale, but you don't exactly.
Right. You want to look like you're exactly.
But anyway, I don't.
Wasn't it Ken at one point that said that? Yeah, there's they make all these decisions that would seem to go against their interests just so they can sort of lull everyone into a sense of false security.
Well, that actually makes more sense, though, as how intelligent people would do that sort of thing. And I don't agree with that, but certainly that seems more plausible to me. But than doing something crazy. But anyway, so I think the key point to me is every delay that the Trump team can get does potentially help them. I mean, the trial on the January 6 charges is scheduled to begin on March 4th, but the pretrial stuff has been put on hold while this immunity thing is being considered. There's also that documents case trial that's supposed to begin on May 20th, but there have been a number of delays in that. And every delay certainly now it looks like these things are going to not happen before the primaries are over. And that's definitely, I guess, a loss for Nikki Haley right at this point and a win for Donald Trump, because if Donald Trump can establish himself as the nominee, then that obviously helps him out considerably. I don't think that all of these trials will be able to be delayed until after January of 2025. Now, if that's the case, then I think it's fairly certain that if Donald Trump were to win the election, he would take whatever steps he could, and some that maybe he couldn't, but he'd try anyway to try to get these federal charges withdrawn. But I don't think that's going to happen, at least in many of these instances. I want to get your take on that.
Yeah, so I think the way it would have to work is now, again, this has never happened before. If you have someone who is indicted before they're president, right, or they were president, now they're not, and then they're indicted. The idea being that you can't indict a sitting president, you can only impeach him, and then that president would be subject to criminal processes after they've left the office. I think there's a strong argument that, if you can't indict a sitting president, you can't convict a sitting president. And Congress would have to go through an impeachment process at that point to remove Trump, which at that point, maybe who cares about the convictions anymore? But I think that's the way it ought to play out. Now, again, I'm spitballing a little bit because this has never happened.
Well, just to be clear, though, it's there is not a law against not indicting a
No. It's that's just the Justice Department has been the Justice Department policy,
and it's a little bit different.
And I think that's let's call it the common understanding is that a sitting president couldn't be indicted just because of separation of powers issues.
But like you said, it's a different question when that there is a person who may have been elected president but was indicted before he actually took the office, won the election. And that's a weird, and I would guess that if this is such a nightmarish kind of scenario, that probably what happened is on his way out the door, Joe Biden would appoint a special counsel to kind of continue the work. And then Donald Trump would appoint an attorney general who would fire that person. And there'd be this big, let's just hope none of this actually happens because, God. But,
well, I would say, if you can't indict, then you can't convict, just on the same separation of powers principles, right? That essentially if I'm kind of putting the rule in the shorthand, it's sort of the court can't remove an elected president.
I see what you're saying. I don't know.
Only Congress through the impeachment process can remove an elected president. And then after that, they're subject to the jurisdiction of the court.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. That's an interesting theoretical sort of question that I hope remains a theoretical question, I'll say. So, but do you agree, right, that Donald Trump will probably not be able to escape some sort of a ruling on at least some of these 91 counts that he's been indicted on before, at least before November of next year?
Yeah, I do.
And it's maybe a different question if there's already been, say, a decision that's been made by a court, and then it's before an appeals court. Well, then that's already outside. I do think that's different if there's an actual conviction. And again, I'm completely spitballing because hell, it's the Friday after Christmas, and I've been kind of been kind of on semi-vacation, and also more importantly, none of there's very scant precedent to actually look at. But I do think a conviction makes a difference. Now, conviction, and then while you're on appeal, yeah. I don't know how that plays out, but I would agree it's different. I'm certain that the Donald Trump's appeals, even if he is convicted of anything, will not be anywhere close to being exhausted by the end of.
Oh no.
Exactly, it'll go on for a long time. So, all right. Well, more on this later. I am certain because, like I said, with 91 charges. There's definitely going to be a lot to talk about as this plays out. All right, let's go. Let's do one more thing, Jay. I want to talk, since we're talking about Donald Trump, and we usually are. Yeah, we usually are. One day, maybe we won't, but not for a while yet. I'm sure you've noticed, maybe you haven't, I don't know. There have been a lot of opinion pieces in the last, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6 months about what would happen if Donald Trump wins in 2024. Most of them tend to be, well, he'd be in a far better position than he was in 2016 to kind of hit the ground running, right? He'd have this loyal cadre of MAGA people to kind of go on his vengeance tour and, be a dictator, at least on day one, maybe not from day one.
Right.
But also I'll point out that there's actually been some concern on the right, not about that so much, although there's been some of that as well, some former generals and other folks but more about some policy things, like, for instance, softening of support for Ukraine. That would probably happen if Trump is in the Oval Office in 2025. But more, something that came up this last week, the Wall Street Journal raised another concern, and that's Donald Trump's trade policies. I mean, Trump has proudly referred to himself as tariff man. Of course, Trump proudly refers to himself pretty much that's, anything.
Right.
But Trump is a big protectionist, right? And he said all kinds of stuff. He's, for instance, floated the idea of just a 10% general tariff on, well, everyone that's not in the U.S., as well as revoking normal trade relations with China and all kinds of stuff. He said this idea from the Biden administration to negotiate a trade agreement with, I believe it's 13 countries in the Asia-Pacific region, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So that will be dead on arrival in my administration. And this is, I think, a very significant concern, certainly. And Jay, I wanted to get your take on this. I know you had a chance to look at that and consider this. What do you think about what would happen with trade in a potential second Trump administration? Does that concern you?
Yeah, it concerns me. I mean, it concerned me in the first Trump administration. I hew to the more traditional Republican free trade type approach. I would agree that in cases such as China, for example, where there is abuse of American IP, of abuse of the system, rampant cheating, I think taking actions there as a means to an end, right? The end being free and fair trade. I think that's acceptable. But protectionism, I don't see as being a legitimate interest. Now, the other legitimate interest I would put in that is maybe quasi-protectionist, right, is ensuring that we have manufacturing capacity and capability to make the important things that we need, right? That we're not overly reliant on someplace like China. So I think there's a fair argument to be made that the trade policy that both parties essentially pursued for the last 30 years is in need of revision.
Absolutely.
Because part of that, a lot of the big premise behind that was that China was going to be would play fair. And the other premise was sort of that as trade expanded with China, so would democratic reform and other general liberalization, and also that the idea that nations that trade with one another don't go to war with one another, that improving these trade relations would dampen any Chinese expansionist tendencies. And that just has proven not to be the case.
Yeah, not at all. And I think the Biden administration has done a good job of sort of trying to balance these things. I know there was some concern on the right when Biden came into office that he was just going to remove all of the things that Donald Trump put on to China and so forth. But actually, the Biden administration has, added on some things of its own, recognizing exactly those sort of things that you're talking about. And I absolutely agree with you that we need to be concerned about rampant Chinese IP abuse and their not being willing to trade fairly, the protectionism and the various barriers they put into place, as well as the importance of ensuring that we have access to strategic materials and manufacturing and that sort of thing. So, but then the problem comes when we're talking about what I think are just stupid things like a 10% across the board tariff on all non-U.S. products. That's just dumb.
Right.
But it sounds good at a rally.
That's the sort of thinking. That's the sort of thinking that led to the Smoot-Hawley tariff of the 1930s, which was disastrous.
Exactly. And to give you a sense of how disastrous, the Tax Foundation, which is a sort of conservative business tax group,
my kind of folks.
Yeah. They said they did some calculation. They said if that Trump 10% tariff went into effect, it would raise the tax burden on American consumers and businesses by around $300 billion, shrink the U.S. economy by around 0.5%, and eliminate more than 500,000 jobs. So this is not exactly the sort of thing you would want to do. And one would hope that this is just a sort of crazy thing that Donald Trump just says because he thinks it sounds good in a rally and that saner heads would prevail. But I think there's a good case to be made that, well, in a second Trump administration, there would be fewer saner heads to prevail. And so we definitely.
Well, and that's my biggest concern.
Yeah.
Is that, look, in the first Trump administration, he was surrounded, not entirely, but enough there were enough grownups in the room. I don't know that any more grownups would sign up for a second Trump term.
Absolutely. And that I think.
So no, in total, if you ask me, where do I stand on this? I'm less concerned about this, the whole Trump will be a dictator and all that sort of stuff, and more concerned on this sort of just really bad ideas and no one to steer them away, and in general, dysfunction.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps it up for this episode. We have a lot more to talk about. I really wanted to get into the whole issue with Harvard President Claudine Gay, and we'll do that on the midweek bonus show. Also, I mentioned there is some interesting polling on how people feel about democracy and elections in the U.S. Not very good. Shocker. And we also want to revisit our predictions, the predictions Jay and I made for 2023, and make some predictions for 2024. All of that's going to come up on the midweek supporter show. And that, of course, always goes out to supporters on usually Tuesdays. And if you're not already a supporter of the show, we hope you'll consider becoming one, because without you guys, the podcast wouldn't be possible. In addition to getting that full length midweek show, you get ad-free versions of everything we do. There's the opportunity to be part of the Discord group, and also the opportunity to be part of the episode. We had a couple listeners, Derek and John, who were with us today and kind of make comments and that sort of thing. So to find out more about all that, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us on Venmo or @politicsguys or through PayPal. As always, we have support links in our show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And if you would like to get that full-length midweek show, but you can't support us financially right now, just send me an email. I'm Mike@politicsguys.com, and I will take care of that for you. And finally, we would like to close out this last show of 2023 with an extra special thanks to our fantastic executive producers. They are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.